The day started like any other at my high school, just the routine hustle and bustle of a normal day. But by the time the final bell should have rung, I was sprinting through the woods, chased by a man who seemed like he didn't belong anywhere near a school. Back when I was a sophomore, my school days followed a predictable rhythm. My bus stop was a quick walk from home, and my high school was just 10 minutes away. It was an average place, with about 700 or 800 students across 4 grades. I had a solid group of friends, and we'd often linger by the lockers between classes, talking about everything from weekend plans to the latest drama. That day was no different. At first, I was standing near my locker with a few friends, including Jake, a junior, and his younger brother Tommy, who was in my grade and part of our friend group. Jake was always the one to stir up excitement, and as the warning bell rang, he casually mentioned he was planning to skip the last class. "I'm heading out early," Jake said with a smirk. "Anyone who wants a ride, let me know." The idea was tempting. The last period of the day always dragged, and the thought of freedom, even for an hour, was alluring. Some of my friends decided to leave, while others stayed, but I hadn't made up my mind yet. That's when everything changed. A strange sound echoed over the intercom. Not the usual bell, but something more jarring. Then came the principal's voice, sharp and urgent. "The school is now under lockdown. All students, report to your next class immediately. Teachers, lock the doors and turn off the lights." Confusion spread through the hall like wildfire. Some students immediately headed to their classrooms, but others, including Jake, saw this as their chance to leave. The hallways turned into chaos as kids darted for the exits, ignoring teachers yelling at them to stay put. Jake didn't hesitate. "Let's go," he said, already walking toward the nearest door. I hesitated for a moment, but as the crowd thinned and the tension grew, I decided to follow. The parking lot was madness. Students were running to their cars, sprinting across the grass toward nearby neighborhoods, or scattering in every direction. I lost sight of Jake and my friends almost immediately. Unsure of where to go, I headed to the main parking lot, hoping to find them, but Jake's car wasn't there. I sprinted to the secondary lot, further behind the school, but by the time I arrived, it was eerily empty. Most cars were still there, but the students were gone. I wandered for a moment, hoping to spot someone I knew, but it was clear they'd left without me. I didn't know what to do. Going back to the school seemed impossible. The doors were likely locked, and I wasn't even supposed to be outside. Walking home wasn't an option either. It was miles away, and I had no way of getting there. As I approached one of the back doors to the school, I saw movement. A man stepped out, and immediately, I knew something was off. He wasn't a teacher or a student. He was too old, disheveled, and seemed out of place. He glanced over his shoulder as if checking for something, and his movements were jittery, almost frantic. I froze, ducking behind a tree nearby. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The man lingered for a moment before he started walking in my direction. Panic set in. Without thinking, I bolted toward the woods. I could hear his footsteps quickening behind me, and I knew he'd seen me. The woods were thick, the kind of place where you could easily lose your bearings, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance as possible between me and him. I ran deeper into the trees, weaving through branches and jumping over roots. The forest seemed endless, and every shadow felt like it was closing in on me. Finally, I stopped, ducking behind a fallen tree to catch my breath. I strained to listen, hoping he hadn't followed. Then I heard it, footsteps crunching on the grass at the edge of the woods. I couldn't take it anymore. Fear overtook me, and I sprinted again, this time toward the faint sound of traffic. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the woods near a street. Spotting a gas station, I ran toward it, desperate for safety. Inside, the employee behind the counter gave me a startled look as I asked to borrow his phone. I explained what had happened, and he handed it over without hesitation. I called my mom, who worked nearby, and she arrived within minutes. Later, I found out the truth about the lockdown. The man I saw had come to the school, drunk and belligerent, demanding to see his daughter. He didn't have custody and hadn't seen her in years. When the custodian tried to remove him, the man made threats, prompting the lockdown. But what I still can't explain is why he followed me into the woods. What was he planning? Was it random? Or did he think I knew something? What do you think? Would you have stayed in the school or tried to leave like I did? And why do you think the man chased me into the woods? High school was supposed to be predictable. Class schedules, lunch periods, and study halls all blending into a routine. But one ordinary day, I found myself sprinting through silent hallways, desperate to avoid someone who seemed like they had no place in our school. It happened during my sophomore year. At my school, lunch and study hall followed our midday classes. Study hall wasn't a big deal. It was a short 25 minutes, and for most of us, it was a chance to catch up on homework or chat quietly with friends. My study hall classroom was usually a teacher's room, but occasionally, when that wasn't available, we'd end up in the gym. On those days, we'd sit on the bleachers or the gym floor, pretending to be productive while our gym teacher kept half an eye on us. This particular day started like any other. After lunch, I lingered with friends in the cafeteria, talking and laughing, not in any rush to get back to class. My gym teacher wasn't the type to mind if students came back a minute or too late, so when the warning bell rang, I still had time to finish my conversation before heading to the classroom. The hallways had emptied by the time I started my walk. When I reached the classroom, something felt off. The door was shut, which wasn't unusual, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Peering through the small window, I saw that the lights inside were off. I stood there, confused. I hadn't heard anything about study hall being moved to the gym today, but it seemed like that must be the case. How had everyone else known? Shrugging off my confusion, I started toward the gym. Halfway there, an announcement crackled over the school speakers. "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms. No students are to be in the hallways." It took a moment for the words to register. A lockdown? The thought made my stomach drop. I was alone in the hallway, with no classroom to retreat to. Panic started to creep in as I quickened my pace toward the gym. But when I reached the doors, they were locked too. That's when it hit me. My study hall hadn't been moved. My classmates and teacher were back in the original classroom, and I had misread the situation. I turned back, walking quickly but trying not to outright run. The hallway was eerily silent, my footsteps the only sound. Then, suddenly, a loud bang shattered the quiet. It echoed down the hall, the unmistakable noise of someone slamming into a locker. My heart raced, and I froze mid-step, straining to hear. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate and heavy, coming from around the corner where I'd heard the bang. Fear gripped me as I turned and started walking in the opposite direction. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were heading straight for me. I spotted a staircase to my left and darted toward it, rushing down the steps two at a time. At the bottom, I bolted down the hallway until I reached the first classroom I saw. Without thinking, I pounded on the door, desperate for someone to let me in. No answer. I tried the handle. It was locked. Panic surged as I glanced over my shoulder. The footsteps were on the stairs now, descending quickly. My breath caught as I saw a pair of legs appear at the top. I didn't stick around to see more. I turned back to the door and knocked harder, hoping, praying that someone would let me in. Finally, the door opened, and the teacher ushered me inside. The lights were off, and the students were huddled in the back of the room, crouched low on the floor. The teacher locked the door behind me, and moments later, the handle jiggled. Someone was trying to get in. They banged on the door, a loud, angry sound that made everyone freeze. The teacher peered through the small window but didn't say anything, her face tense. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. The person had left, but the fear lingered. We stayed locked down for what seemed like hours, though it was probably closer to one. When the lockdown was finally lifted, I was called to the principal's office to answer questions about what had happened. They didn't tell me much, only that the lockdown had been triggered by an intruder, a person who shouldn't have been in the building. I still don't know what would have happened if that person had caught up to me in the hallway. Maybe they weren't dangerous, but then again, maybe they were. I don't want to think about what could have happened if the classroom door hadn't opened in time. What do you think? Should schools handle lockdowns differently to ensure students aren't caught in the hallways? And what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Back in my junior year of high school, I had a pretty predictable morning routine. The school bus would drop us off about 15 minutes before classes started, giving me just enough time to get to my locker and hang out with my friends. My locker was on the second floor, and not far from it was a large window at the end of the hallway. The ledge in front of the window became our go-to spot, a kind of pre-class hangout where my friends and I would sit and talk every morning. From that window, we had a great view of part of the parking lot, the softball field, and on good days, the sun rising over the eastern horizon, which bathed the hallway in warm, golden light. One particular morning started out like any other. I arrived at school, went to my locker, and then joined my friends by the window. There were about 5 of us chatting about random stuff. Homework we hadn't done, weekend plans, the usual. When the warning bell rang, signaling that we had 2 minutes to get to class, we started to break off and head in different directions. As I looked out the window one last time, I noticed a few kids rushing in to avoid being late. But then my attention caught on someone else. A man was hurrying into the school. He didn't look like a teacher or a student, too old to be one, and definitely not dressed like the other. He wore an oversized sweatshirt and baggy sweatpants, the kind of clothes you'd throw on if you didn't care about making an impression. At first, I thought he might be a substitute teacher, but something about him felt off. Still, I didn't think too much about it and headed to my class. My classroom was also on the second floor, so it wasn't far from where I'd been. As I walked down the hallway, I happened to glance toward the staircase at the end of the hall. The same man I'd just seen entering the school was now coming up the stairs. He didn't seem in a rush, just walking slowly and looking around. I slipped into my classroom, not giving it much more thought. The day carried on uneventfully, class after class, nothing out of the ordinary. By lunchtime, I had nearly forgotten about the strange man. That is, until I saw him again. As I sat with a couple of friends in the lunchroom, he walked in briefly, looked around, and then exited through another door. I remember thinking it was strange that I'd even noticed him. My school wasn't small by any means, and with so many students milling about, it would have been easy for someone to blend into the crowd. The day went on, and I didn't see him again until the last period of the day. We were about halfway through class when the phone at the teacher's desk rang. He picked it up, nodded a few times, and then hung up. His expression shifted into something more serious as he told us the school was going into lockdown. He instructed us to move to the back of the classroom, where we sat on the floor as he locked the door and turned off the lights. Confusion swept through the room. My classmates whispered to each other, speculating about what was happening. The teacher wouldn't tell us anything, only repeating that we needed to stay quiet and calm. My mind didn't even go to the man I'd seen earlier. I was just as clueless as everyone else, wondering if this was a drill or something more serious. We stayed like that for nearly an hour, the silence only broken by the occasional muffled sound from somewhere in the building. When the lockdown was finally lifted, the relief in the room was palpable. We packed up and left, still in the dark about what had happened. On the bus ride home, the topic on everyone's lips was the lockdown. No one seemed to know what had caused it, but the atmosphere was tense. When I got home, my mom was waiting for me. She had already heard more about the situation than I had. She told me that a man, the same one I'd seen entering the school that morning, was the reason for the lockdown. Apparently, during the last class period, he'd been spotted wandering suspiciously in one of the hallways. The school immediately called for a lockdown and notified the police. But by the time officers arrived, the man had escaped through an open window. I was stunned. This man had been in the building since the very start of the day, moving around unnoticed. How had no one else seen him? Or, if they had, why didn't anyone report it sooner? I told my mom about seeing him multiple times and how it blew my mind that he'd gone undetected for so long. Thankfully, he hadn't harmed anyone, but his presence in the school was unsettling, to say the least. Even now, I think about how easily someone like that was able to slip under the radar. Who was he? Why was he there? Was he just lost? Or did he have a darker reason for being in the school? I'll probably never know, but the thought still sends chills down my spine. What do you think? Could the school have handled the situation better? How would you have reacted if you'd noticed the same man wandering around? It was 2017, and I was a freshman in high school. Like most teenagers, I had my fair share of boring classes, but math was by far the worst for me. I wasn't great at it, and most days, I found myself staring out the window, daydreaming instead of paying attention. That day wasn't any different, except I had something to look forward to: my orthodontics appointment. My mom was coming to pick me up, and once I was done with the appointment, I'd get to skip the rest of the day. My third period math class was on the second floor, and my seat was in the back corner, perfectly positioned to look out over the front parking lot. I kept glancing down, hoping to see my mom's car pull in. Instead, I saw something unexpected. Several police cars drove past, their lights off but moving purposefully. I figured there had been an accident nearby, or maybe they were responding to something in the area. I didn't think much of it, though it was strange to see them turn into the school's parking lot. Just as I was trying to make sense of the police cars, the classroom door opened, and a student walked in with a pass. I knew it was for me. My teacher called my name, handed me the day's homework assignment, and I packed up my things. I left the classroom, relieved to escape math and excited to leave school early. As I made my way through the empty hallway, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom. She told me she was waiting at the side door, which happened to be at the opposite end of the school. It would take me a few minutes to get there, but I wasn't in a hurry. The halls were quiet, the usual hum of student activity replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Then, as I walked, the intercom crackled to life. "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms." My stomach dropped. A lockdown? I immediately felt a wave of unease. Lockdowns weren't common, and the fact that this wasn't a drill made it worse. My first instinct was to get out of the school as fast as possible. I didn't know if there was actual danger, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I sped up my pace, trying to reach the side door before anyone noticed me in the hallway. If a teacher saw me, they'd likely pull me into their classroom, and I'd be stuck. As I turned a corner, I heard footsteps echoing down an intersecting hallway. I froze, not wanting to run into whoever it was. I ducked behind a row of lockers and waited, hoping they wouldn't see me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I decided to backtrack and take a different route. As I turned to leave, the footsteps suddenly quickened, as if the person had started running. My heart raced. I wasn't sure if they'd seen me, but I wasn't taking any chances. I broke into a sprint, heading for the stairs. I ran down the steps, thinking there was no way they'd follow me. But they did. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind me, growing closer. At that point, it was clear I was being followed. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a teacher? Or someone else entirely? I reached the bottom of the stairs and bolted down a long, straight hallway. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the person chasing me. At the end of the hallway, I turned the corner and finally saw the side exit up ahead. Relief surged through me, but when I glanced back, I froze. The person following me wasn't a teacher. It was a man with long, stringy black hair, wearing a black leather jacket. I had no idea who he was, but his appearance sent a chill down my spine. He wasn't someone I recognized, and he definitely didn't belong in the school. I sprinted to the side doors, flung them open, and ran to my mom's car, throwing myself into the passenger seat. My mom could tell something was wrong immediately, and I blurted out everything. The lockdown, the man who had followed me, and the police cars I'd seen earlier. She grabbed her phone and called the school to report what had happened. As we drove away, we passed more police cars in the front parking lot. It all started to click. The man must have been connected to whatever had caused the lockdown. Later that day, I learned the full story. The man was a fugitive, fleeing from police after a car chase. His vehicle had gotten stuck in a ditch, and he took off on foot, eventually making his way onto the school campus. The police hadn't realized he'd entered the building at first and were mainly searching the area behind the school. Eventually, an officer went inside and found him wandering the hallways. No one was hurt, and the situation was resolved quickly. But the thought of him following me still haunts me. I don't know why he singled me out or what he wanted. Maybe he thought I'd lead him to an exit, or maybe it was something worse. Either way, I was lucky to get away. What would you have done in my shoes? Should the school have been better prepared for a situation like this? And why do you think the man followed me instead of hiding? I've been a high school history teacher for several years now, and during that time, I've dealt with my fair share of challenging students and chaotic days, but nothing compares to the day I found myself locked in a teacher's lounge with an intruder trying to break in. It's a memory that still sends chills down my spine. It was a normal school day, at least that's how it started. I had just finished teaching my second period class and was heading into my free period, the 1 hour in the day where I didn't have a class to teach. Usually, I spent this time grading papers or preparing lessons, but on this particular day, I decided to treat myself to a cup of coffee. The history department had its own teacher's lounge, a small but cozy break room just a short walk down the hall from my classroom. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few couches, a table, some chairs, a fridge, and a TV. Oddly, the room had 2 windows that faced the hallway, but they were always covered with heavy curtains for privacy. To this day, I'm not sure why those windows were there in the first place, but they didn't bother me much. The room was quiet and comfortable, with carpeted floors and just enough space for the 5 teachers in our department to unwind. I took my time making coffee, enjoying the brief respite from the chaos of teaching. That's when I heard the announcement. The school intercom crackled to life, and a voice declared, "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill." For a moment, I stood there in disbelief. In all my years of teaching, I had never experienced a real lockdown. We had practice drills plenty of times, but this felt different. Something serious was happening, and I had no idea what it could be. Curious and slightly concerned, I walked to the door of the lounge and peeked into the hallway. It was eerily silent. I half expected to see students rushing to find classrooms, but the corridor was completely empty. Assuming everyone was already safely locked inside their rooms, I went back to the lounge, grabbed my coffee, and prepared to head back to my classroom. But when I opened the door again, I saw someone. He was a man, probably in his mid to late 20s, walking down the hallway toward me. He was too old to be a student, and he definitely wasn't a teacher. He wore baggy clothes that looked a little worse for wear, and something about him immediately put me on edge. My instincts screamed that he didn't belong here. I quickly shut the door and locked it. My heart was racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. Seconds later, I heard the doorknob jiggle, followed by a knock. My breath caught in my throat as the man's voice called out from the other side. "Let me in," he said, his tone sharp and demanding. I froze, unsure of what to do. For a brief moment, I considered responding, but the way he spoke made my stomach twist. Instead, I pulled out my phone and tried calling the principal. The phone rang, but no one picked up. "Who are you?" I shouted through the door. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he repeated his demand, "Let me in." I tried calling the principal again, but still no answer. The silence on the other side of the door was deafening, and for a moment, I thought the man might have left. I was about to let out a sigh of relief when the sound of shattering glass pierced the air. I turned toward the window, my heart pounding. Through the heavy curtains, I could see the outline of the man smashing the glass with some kind of blunt object. My body froze as the window shattered completely, and before I could process what was happening, he started climbing through. That was all I needed to see. I bolted for the door, flung it open, and sprinted down the hallway toward my classroom. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following me. When I reached my classroom, I unlocked the door, slipped inside, and locked it behind me in one fluid motion. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I grabbed my phone again and dialed the police. The dispatcher assured me that officers were already on their way and that the school was secure. I stayed in my classroom, listening for any sounds of movement outside, but everything was quiet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lockdown was lifted. Later, I learned the truth. The man had snuck into the school after fleeing from police. Apparently, he was high on drugs and had led officers on a short chase before ditching his car and running onto the campus. No one had realized he was inside the building until the lockdown was initiated. The police eventually found him still in the teacher's lounge. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the experience left me shaken. To this day, I don't know why he tried to get into the lounge or what his intentions were. What would you have done in my place? Should schools have better protocols to prevent intruders from getting inside? And what do you think the man was trying to accomplish by breaking into the lounge?